Well, I think we're live, and I'd like to welcome you to this event today. My name is Paul Wapner. I teach in the Global Environmental Politics program in the School of International Service here at American University. And it's such a pleasure to welcome you, and I'm so excited that so many of you had decided to join. As many of you know, that on July 11th is going to be World Population Day, and this is an event organized by the UN to draw attention to population issues. And population is sort of, at one hand, often seen as a root of so many problems, and at the same time seen as perhaps a distraction. And so today what we're going to do on this panel is we're going to reflect on the complexities of population as a global phenomenon and as a regional phenomenon as well. So, and I'm going to be accompanied by panelists, and I'd like to introduce who's going to be joining us today. First, I would like to welcome Tazreena Sajjad. Tazreena is a political scientist and an IR scholar. She teaches in the Global Governance, Politics, and Security program here at the School of International Service. And her research and teaching revolve around issues of migration, transnational justice, post-conflict reconstruction, and gender and conflict. So Tazreena, thank you so much for joining us. Our second panelist is Austin Davis. And Austin will be coming in a second. There he is. Austin is an economist, and Austin is in the program of international development in the School of International Service. And his teaching and research revolve around issues of economic development, migration, and labor market mobility in low and middle income countries. So welcome, Austin. And our third panelist is Professor Rachel Robinson. And Rachel is a sociologist as well as a demographer. She is also in the International Development Program in SIS. And her research and teaching focus on population studies, global health, environmental sustainability, and development. So welcome, Rachel. And one thing I just want to point out is if we have here, this is very much of a snapshot of SIS. This is an interdisciplinary panel, and that's very much what SIS is about. So I'm excited that we could all join together. So the format for today, first a quick note, I'd ask that we don't record this session. The session is going to be recorded and it'll be available on SIS's YouTube channel, so there's no reason for individuals to record it. And as for the format, basically, I'm going to begin by moderating a conversation between the panelists, and that'll go for about 45 minutes. And then we're going to open it up for questions from you, the audience, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. So, and we're going to use a polling program to sort of focus the conversation, because the conversation is going to revolve around basically 3 or 4 questions. And the first question we're going to jump into, and we're going to launch a poll on this, is there a population crisis? I mean, we take this for granted, but is there a population crisis? So I'd ask you to check yes, no, or maybe, hopefully not maybe, but and let us know what you're thinking. And we'll give you just a second to do that. And then Rachel, I'd love to invite you to get us started with some thoughts about, do you think there's a population crisis?
Sure. Thanks so much, Paul, for the introduction, and to all of you for being here. I guess, Kate, can you show the results from the poll? So we've got 63% yes, 19% no, and 19% maybe. Okay, awesome. So I want everybody to sort of keep your thoughts in mind and then reflect on it as you listen to us talk throughout the panel, and then we can come back to some of those things at the end. So I wanted to start off by saying that, at first glance, yeah, it seems like maybe there is a population crisis. So there were 5 billion people on our planet in 1987. There's 7.5 billion today. Projections estimate that population growth will level out around 10 billion around 2050. It's a lot of people, and it's a lot of people fast, just in terms of in the span of, any of our lifetimes. But I want to give you a few reasons for not thinking about these reasons in terms of crisis so much. And the first reason, when you call it a population crisis, it probably means you should do something about it, right? If you say something is a crisis, it's a call for action. And specifically, what does that mean? Well, it means we should try to change the size of the population. And there's really not too many ways to do that. The first is totally macabre, right? You can try to do away with people who are already here. We've decided that that is generally not ethically okay, thankfully. And if you're talking about the country level, you could try to get people to leave one place, or you can try to get more people to come into another place. And my other panelists are going to talk about migration in a second. But if you're talking at a planetary level, again, we cannot send enough people into space with Elon Musk or anyone else, to make any sort of a difference at this point. So basically what it comes down to is you're talking about fertility and preventing people from being born. And reducing fertility through the use of contraception, which is often made available through large-scale family planning programs in developing countries, is completely possible. But it's really important to think about why and how it's done. So specifically, if we say that every woman and couple has the right to freely decide and achieve their desired fertility, the desired number of children they want to have, that's very different than saying, well, everybody in the world should just have 2 children. And so the risk is that when you frame the problem as one of population crisis, programs tend to end up not being motivated by rights, coercion can increase, and people can be robbed of their reproductive rights. So this is one reason not to think about things in terms of crisis. The second is that trends are heading towards lower fertility anyway. So about half the world's countries and about half the world's population have what's called below replacement fertility. And that means that on average, women have slightly more than 2 children. And it turns out that the total fertility rate, or the average number of children per woman, roughly speaking, of the 3 most populous countries in the world is either at or below this replacement rate, or very close to it. So in China, the world's most populous country, the total fertility rate is 1.7 children per woman. In India, it's 2.2 children per woman. And in the US, it's also 1.7 children. So there's actually many wealthy countries that would like to increase their fertility so that they can take the pressure off of their pension systems. Africa is the last region in the world where there's particularly high rates of fertility. And on average there, women have about 5 children. So that's a second reason. Trends are already heading in this direction. The third reason is that humans have immense capacity for innovation. And this has helped us meet some of the pressures that large populations do genuinely present. And concerns about population size have existed since at least the time of Malthus, who was writing around 1800. But in particular, in the 1960s, as the benefits of medical innovations like antibiotics and vaccines led to massive mortality declines and thus rapid population growth, there was a lot of very realistic concern about the ability of the planet to feed itself. However, scientific advances in food production, called the Green Revolution, increased yields multiple times over, meaning that we now have more than enough food to feed people. The challenge is getting it to people who need it. And that is a social and political problem. That is not a population problem. The other problem, of course, and I'll say this is, as somebody who does research on global health, is getting people to eat healthy food. And that's also a social and a political problem. So namely, we need more people to eat plant-based diets, which have an immense benefit for the planet. So while I don't necessarily advocate for, waiting for technology to save us all, we can actually use our big human brains to make the world a better place. And then fourth and finally, just describing the challenges we face as a planet, as a population crisis, I think really takes our eye off the ball. We have a consumption crisis. We consume too much oil, too much meat, too many resources. It doesn't have to be that way, but to make changes, we have to ask hard questions and we need to work together. And that's really hard. Those are the types of things that we talk about at SIS all the time. We probably have to dismantle capitalism if we're being fully honest. So I'm just going to end there, but I'll just put a plug in. Paul's going to give a bit of a response, but his ideas about wildness in his most recent book really provide some good inspiration for thinking about thinking in different ways that can help point us to innovative solutions to these types of challenges we face. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Rachel. And I always appreciate hearing you and learning from you. So I see it a little different. I actually think, I love when you say we have a consumption problem, not a population problem. But I think one could argue that a consumption problem is a population problem. And I want to suggest that by suggesting that I think there are three population crises. One is, I think there's a population crisis in the North, that yes, our fertility rates have gone down, but because of our consumption, that in fact we have a sort of an out-shaped impact on the planet. We do live in a culture of consumption, and one that takes economic growth as a fundamental assumption of what life is about. And from a carrying capacity problem, I think that's a challenge. Just in terms of carbon footprint, we're told that a single child born today in the United States has the equivalent carbon footprint of 7 Chinese children being born today, or 168 children born in Bangladesh, if we're talking about the sort of consumption translated into carbon, a carbon measure. So I actually think there's a population problem in the North. I also, though, think there's a population problem in the South as well. The numbers of people is sort of overwhelming infrastructures in ways that are very, that leads to a lot of injustice and a lot of dislocation. And I think, as we'll talk later, that I think this is partly a push for migration away from these areas because of the overwhelming ability to meet the needs of people who are living there. Again, it's not just numbers, but I think numbers, because of the context which they're in, it may in fact be easier to reduce numbers as well as addressing some of these other issues. And the third crisis I would just point out is that there is a cost to the amount and the consumptive character of humans, which is that we're not the only species on the planet. And we share this planet with multiple other life forms. And we can probably, as you say, feed ourselves, provide water for ourselves, provide healthcare for ourselves. But I'm not convinced that we can do that easily if we don't reduce our numbers and have some sensitivity to sharing this planet with the more than human world. So yeah, and finally, I would just say that I love your point about the challenge of reducing fertility. And though I think we know we can do this in non-coercive ways. We know that educating women or providing contraception to people who want it, social welfare, those kinds of things, I think, are tools for reducing population. And so, but let me give you, why don't you respond to that, Rachel? And then I'll go to another question. But yeah, do you have any comments?
No, I guess I think it's in the framing, right? And I do think the framing is incredibly important, particularly in the political era that we live in now. So yes, I don't disagree that, for example, large numbers of people overwhelm infrastructure. I would still call it an infrastructure problem and not a population problem, because population has been used by, populist leaders as a scapegoat. it gets then, it allows leaders in wealthy countries to ignore their own responsibilities in other places of the world. But I really, your point about we're not the only species on the planet, I think is a really good one to take away. And in terms about being a living things that share the planet with others, that is crucial. And is exactly what I love about your perspective and in your book too. It makes you think about the world differently when you remember that. So I'll stop there.
Okay, but thank you for that. The really important point, how we frame these issues is basically going to mobilize energy, money, policies, and so forth. And I think it's super important that we be really careful in how we frame these so we can address them in meaningful ways. So let's shift a little bit to look at the question of crisis in a different way. We're going to put another poll up. And the question here is there a migrant or refugee crisis in the US, Europe, or elsewhere? And I see we've turned this into 3 questions, it looks like. But why don't you respond? And if you could respond quickly, that would be fabulous. And as people are responding, I'm going to first turn to Tazreena. And Tazreena, I'm going to ask you, if you could, what are your reflections on this question? Is there a migration refugee crisis globally? Is there one in the United States? Is there one in Europe? However you like to, oh, we have the results. Wow, okay. More people think that there's a migration and refugee crisis than population. Fabulous. Tazreena, thoughts? And unmute yourself, Tazreena.
Right. Thank you for that question, Paul. And I loved the way you, both of you, Rachel and Paul, began this conversation about framing, because framing is the most important thing that there is when we talk about these questions. I get very fascinated by the word crisis. And so in my classes, migration and development, or gender and conflict, or the refugees class at my graduate level, I try and unpack that quite a bit in terms of really asking people, so we use that term quite a bit. There's a refugee crisis, there's a border crisis, there's a migrant crisis. And I really want to delve deep into what is it a crisis of, right? Because when we have that knee-jerk, ad hoc sort of response to this understanding there's a crisis, certainly there's this idea we need to do something about it. But certainly we also miss out on the fact that our perceptions or misperceptions rather, and our consumption of certain kinds of images really obscure facts on the ground, which is, first of all, I have to ask, is it a crisis of too many refugees and migrants? Or is it a question of too many refugees and migrants in terms of being in the so-called global north? Right? And that's where we have our most amount of attention on. So just to give you a few facts. One, fundamentally, we assume that there is a migrant crisis because there are larger numbers of people moving in the world than ever before. And I would just say, yes, but it's actually about 3.5% of the world's population when we talk about international migrants. And as I tell my students, that's more or less just a little bit above a margin of error of ±3. And so the world's largest number of people are actually not crossing international borders. I mean, imagine if we were talking about even 10% of the world's population moving, and we can't even conceive of that given the structures that we have right now. The second is that we are sort of more focused on this question of a crisis in the United States, a crisis in Europe, and that's because of the media sort of feeding into certain understandings of we have never seen this number of people in the world. And I just want the audience to sort of think about the fact that 86% of the world's refugee population actually live in the global south. 73% of the world's refugee population actually live in neighboring countries. So prior to 2015, when the word crisis sort of erupted into our, into Western lexicon, we were not really so much thinking about the word crisis and refugees and migrants in the same actual way. And I think that the emphasis in terms of, where our attention lies, where our empathy and sympathy lies, really matters. Because if you look at the largest number of refugee hosts in the world, there is Turkey, there's Colombia, there is Pakistan, there's Uganda. Since 2015, there's Germany, but then there's Jordan and Bangladesh and Iran. And in terms of per capita, of refugee versus population, there's Lebanon, Jordan, Nauru, Turkey, which is at the sort of crossroads of East and West, Liberia, Uganda, Malta, Sudan, and then there's Sweden and South Sudan. So again, we have only 1 or 2 countries of the global north in that mix, but our assumption is that most refugees and asylum seekers are generally moving to the United States or to Europe. And so we don't really think about the fact that, one, what is it a crisis of, right? It is a crisis in terms of questions of infrastructure and resources in host countries, but that's completely out of our sort of range of thinking about these issues in the long term or in the broader picture. I would also say there's a crisis of understanding, which means not just in terms of a crisis of empathy and sympathy, but in terms of actually grappling with the facts on the ground and reality. And there is also, of course, a crisis of solidarity and a crisis of reception, which I want to build on a little later on in a different question. And so I want students and all the audience to grapple with the fact that we are living with large numbers of people being produced as a result of multiple forms of crisis, but ultimately it is a crisis of the people themselves. And we forget that when we start talking about questions of, borders, and we start talking questions of capacities, and our focus primarily is on the United States not being able to handle, or Europe as a continent not being able to handle, rather than thinking about refugee host countries that singularly host more than 1 million refugees within their spaces within any given period of time that we don't pay attention to, or the people who have lost a lot and who do not have the right of return in many instances, or are not able to return, or are not, are caught in situations that are disruptive of them being able to live their lives to the fullest. So where we put the emphasis on in terms of the question of crisis really matters.
Thank you, Tazreena. Austin, do you have thoughts on this question?
I do. Yeah, thank you, Tazreena. That was actually a wonderful introduction to the kind of narrower, zoomed in picture that I'd like to talk about. So I want to focus a little bit on one particular population, a refugee population in the Global South that I've been working with for several years now. Just to provide a little bit of background, over the course of decades, the government of Myanmar has progressively taken rights from the Rohingya people, including citizenship, education, and even basic liberty. This campaign has been punctuated by episodes of violence, the most recent of which took place in August 2017, when a government military offensive pushed about 750,000 people across the border into Bangladesh. And today, the vast majority of these people reside in camps administered by humanitarian organizations and overseen by the government of Bangladesh. So together with a number of colleagues, we've been running a survey of the Rohingya people residing in the camps and the Bangladeshi host community. The survey is large. We speak to over 5,000 households, and it's representative of the underlying population. So it allows us to make generalized statements without worrying that we're extrapolating from anecdotes. There's a lot to talk about here, but I do want to mention 2 main findings that for me resonate with this idea of crisis. The first is livelihoods and economic well-being. So in the year leading up to August 2017, again, when that violence and large-scale displacement took place, Rohingya households had similar levels of employment and earnings to Bangladeshi households who were living just on the other side of the border. Employment and earnings of Bangladeshi households had changed very little as of 2019, 2 years later, but Rohingya families saw significant declines. Rohingya people were less than half as likely to be employed, and among those who were employed, they were earning less than half as much. Displacement is also associated with a significant loss of assets. While Bangladeshi households, if anything, have accumulated assets during this time, most Rohingya households lost productive assets that they owned in Myanmar, particularly land-dwelling livestock and agricultural equipment. So whatever modest wealth and self-sufficiency Rohingya families had achieved in Myanmar has been almost entirely wiped out. The other domain I'll mention is trauma and mental health. It was common for Rohingya respondents to report a variety of traumatic events, especially being close to death, torture, combat, and witnessing the murder of a friend or a family member. These are much more common in the Rohingya population than among Bangladeshi households or a number of international comparison groups. And perhaps not surprisingly, depression is common. So compared to the US general population, Rohingya individuals are 3 to 5 times more likely to meet screening criteria for depression. And on top of all that, this is another point that Tazreena emphasized. There's no clear path for Rohingya to exit the camp environment. There's no safe way for them to return home, and the government of Bangladesh is not eager to have them enter the country and leave the camps. So, in my view, this particular population, these individuals, these families really are experiencing an ongoing crisis, and that is, I think, those experiences are things we should have at the front of our minds.
Well, thank you, Austin. And I think in some ways you've both your comments set us up for the third topic we want to look at, which is this question of integrating migrants across borders. And I think, Tazreena, you've given us a great sense that this is not just happening, in fact, far from happening just in the United States or Europe, but it's happening in neighboring countries and so forth. So I think we'd like to ask the participants now, if you could, on this poll, is there a crisis of integrating now refugees into countries? And there's 3 dimensions to this, and that third dimension I would just sort of, again, underline with Tazreena and actually what Austin are suggesting, that this is also a problem for neighboring countries and also within countries. There's lots of migration from rural areas to urban areas and so forth. So is there a crisis of integration here? And if you could vote and tell us how you feel, that'd be really helpful. And as people are voting, Austin, I'm going to turn it to you, get us started on this question of integration. Well, here's our results. So Austin, you can look at those and then share your thoughts with us.
Sure. Yeah. No. Absolutely. So it seems like there's a pretty strong consensus among the audience that there is a crisis of integration, and broadly, I agree. But I would say, to the extent that there is one, I would argue that political opposition plays a significant part here. Political opposition to integration is widespread, and it's often strongly held. It indeed is the very reason we have things called refugee camps. It's why we have quota systems where, in the US, we only admit a tiny number of refugees every year. Of course, there are some notable exceptions, some of which Tazreena mentioned already. Germany, Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon have all collectively received, and Sweden have collectively received millions of refugees, many of whom are able to live and work and learn outside of a camp setting. But drawing on casual observations of the US and my work in Bangladesh, there is often strong political and popular opposition to welcoming refugees in that way, to that extent. And in my view, what's particularly disappointing is that the concerns that opponents raise, or at least the ones that they articulate or that they use to rationalize their position, like competition for jobs or high prices for staple goods, they don't have a really strong theoretical basis, and they're not broadly supported by empirical research either. So why are these concerns kind of theoretically simplistic? Well, there's a lot to say here. I could go on for a while, but one core reason is that migrants are not only people who would like to have jobs, but they're also people who and they're not only people who consume in the host economy, but they also create jobs and they make things. And so there's a significant set of countervailing forces that actually wind up being more important in many cases. A famous empirical example, at least among economists, is the Mariel boat lift, which was a mass emigration in 1980 from Cuba to South Florida. And in the span of just a few months, over 100,000 people arrived on the shores of South Florida. Given the size and suddenness of the migration, this seems like a case that would be very likely to generate some negative consequences like unemployment, if they exist. Now, a lot of ink has been spilled on this particular episode, but the most persuasive research finds no negative impacts on the host community or people who are already in South Florida at the time, even among those who are most likely to be competing with the new migrants for jobs. So people whose demographic characteristics were the most similar, the ones who are going to be looking for the closest types of jobs. Even there doesn't seem to have been a negative impact. In Bangladesh, there's some limits to what I can say from my research definitively, but we see no evidence of negative economic consequences for the host community. I'll say an important caveat here is that the international humanitarian response has been a significant source of local employment and has also coordinated the supply of a lot of basic goods. So there is a nuanced interplay of forces there. But still, the political opposition to any sort of integration in Bangladesh remains strong. To give a particularly vivid example, the government requires that Rohingya students learn to write in Burmese script rather than in Bengali script. So even if these kids were allowed to, enter Bangladeshi society, they'd be, missing a really important part of their education. No one is meant to leave the camps, although some people do. So I'll pass it along to Tazreena now. I'm sure she has some important insights on this question too, but basically I would say I think there is an integration crisis, and it seems to be at least in large part to me, a political one, but one that isn't maybe on a very strong foundation.
Tazreena, could you unmute yourself? Good. Okay.
Thank you, Austin. I really appreciated the fact that you talked about nuance, and I really appreciated the fact that you used certain facts in order to illustrate the fact that the question of integration is much more complex on the ground. I would look at the question of integration in multiple ways. One, what do we mean by integration? So the definition. The second is the question of perspective and perception again. And the third is context specificity, right? And until unless we understand and sort of delve into each of these issues, we can't have a sense of whether there is a so-called crisis or whether it's actually happening in our heads, and that's what we are assuming from the information that we're being sort of being fed. One is, integration in the United States with regard to, if you're only going to focus on refugees, and I never work on binaries, by the way, but that's a different conversation altogether. But if you're going to talk about de jure and to some extent de facto refugees, the context of the United States is very different from the continent of Europe. And that is very different from each of the countries, whether we're talking about Lebanon, Jordan, Bangladesh, Iran, Pakistan, so on and so forth. So in the United States actually has a very established refugee program where it hand selects refugees to come into the United States, and through a very rigorous sort of mechanism, not perfect, there are different kinds of organizations involved in supporting those refugees, again, not perfectly. And then, of course, refugees integrating into the American system to be able to access political rights, social rights, cultural rights, and economic rights. And so the refugees are a very important component, along with other migrants, in the US economy and US society. It's something that we have failed, in fact, to sort of communicate effectively to the American populace, particularly in the times of xenophobia. So that's one issue. In the context of Europe doesn't really have, in terms of a broader comprehensive infrastructure, a refugee program. It has an asylum system. And then you have individual countries that also have their own ways of accepting refugees and asylum seekers. And so that also breaks down in very specific ways. So Southern Europe, like Spain and Italy, have a different kind of approach. Northern European countries are much more far removed, except since 2015, from this question of large numbers of asylum seekers and refugees, mostly speaking, although at different moments in time in history, after the Second World War, the Bosnian War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, you've had larger numbers of people who have moved into Western Europe. And so within that context, of course, the French model of what integration means for migrants is very different from the British model. And the British model is very different from the Swedish model. Again, so we cannot generalize, but we are actually not talking about large numbers of people. Again, that's perception, not reality. But the perception drives what Austin has said, certain kinds of politics, and the politics also sort of influences that perception. So to give you an understanding of that, since Islamophobia is so rampant in both the United States as well as, of course, Europe, the perception of the Muslim population in Europe is very conflated compared to reality. So for instance, in Italy, Germany, and Belgium, according to a research done a few years ago, the people believe that Muslims make up a fifth of their country's population, which in reality is basically under 7%. Or that in Poland, the understanding is that the Polish citizens, when the survey was done, believed that Muslims account for 5% of the population. It's actually about 0.1% or so. So again, perception is driving a lot of the narrative, and we have to be careful and conscious of that. The third is, as I mentioned, context specificity. And in that issue, again, it's a reminder for us to think about the fact that if 80% of the world's displaced and refugees are moving into neighboring countries, these are countries with infrastructural issues, issues and challenges with large populations, particularly youth populations, as well as their own environmental crises that they're dealing with, right? So when you have people confined in camps, and that's a problematic way that has emerged in the international system to deal with displaced populations, that's a different sort of way of managing a mobile population that you wish, or at least everybody wishes, were transient. But there's also, has always been local integration that we have not paid attention to. The fact that in the case of the Rohingya, although over 700,000, that's a huge number, by the way, over 700,000 Rohingya arrived in Bangladesh in 2017 within a span of a few months. You've always had, except for moments of crisis, the Rohingya people moving in and out of the borders, just because the borders are not the way that we conceive of borders in terms of highly militarized walls or fencing. That's very much part of our public discourse, particularly in the West, but also having growing salience elsewhere. So you have always had, in the context of Lebanon and Syria, in the context of, Colombia and Venezuela, you've always had people who have lived across and moved around borders. And there's always been informal ways of integrating with local populations. Now, when you insert politics into this, and when you insert a rising, xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiments, as well as different kinds of crises, whether it's economic crisis, whether it's a regional one, an international one, a global one, and when you have more license that is given to powerful states to get away with doing what they do to people who are not considered citizens, then you are creating the possibility and potential for greater vulnerability, and reducing the conversations around local integration further, because you're trying to keep populations separate. You are more focused on the challenges that they bring to the ground rather than the opportunities, economic and otherwise. And so the conversations become very different, and we start again, painting broad pictures when we again have to pay attention to context, nuance, and complexity in each and every one of these situations.
Well, thank you, Tazreena and Austin. Rachel, you're a demographer. You study movements of people, you study increases, and I'm going to turn to questions from the audience in just a second, but and I'll certainly call on you then, but I wanted just to know if you had any thoughts as you're listening to the conversation that you'd like to offer.
Yeah, this has just been wonderful. I mean, thank you everyone for your perspectives, because you see, I've got my pen in hand and I'm taking notes. One of the things that kept coming to mind was then this question about so why the politics? And as somebody asked in the Q&A already, you know, don't we need to integrate Republicans and Democrats? And I want to mention a book and then sort of, you know, put in my plea for what something that might work. So the book is called Strangers in Their Own Land, and it's by Arlie Russell Hochschild. And that was the book that all freshmen read at AU maybe four or 5 years ago. And she wrote it about the Tea Party in Louisiana in particular. And it's a question in essence of like, why do people support political views that are not in their own self-interest in essence? So she talks about people essentially being left behind. And the main reason is because they feel left behind, because they have been left out of opportunities. And so it is much easier to blame the immigrants who did not actually take their job, but who it seems like might have taken their job. Or it is easier to blame some other problem than the broader system at large, which has disadvantaged them. It does leave people behind. And so I think something that all of us can advocate for and work towards is social equity and social justice in any of the places that we live. A more equitable and just place will be more welcoming to any outsiders who arrive. It will help those who are living in it and who, you know, it will make them less likely to be suffering from injustices and it will allow us to frame problems in the best possible way so that we can address them, so that politics will always be there, but to make it so that when we talk about crises, we're getting closer to talking about the actual root cause so that we can put our efforts and our resources towards that root cause, as opposed to just spinning our political wheels and doing real damage to people in the process. So that was more of a sociological answer than a demographic answer, but.
No, but it was very helpful. So we have a few questions that actually revolve around this issue of xenophobia. And I think I'll read two of those questions, and we can actually hear the way in which we each sort of sometimes frame things in different ways. So one question, the first question we received was, is high fertility rate in Africa, but low rates in OECD countries fueling xenophobia? So the question seems to be, is it simply this disproportionality of fertility rates itself that's fueling xenophobia? And I'll just add to that another question that has to do with this. Another question says, isn't this an issue of accepting migrant arrivals rather than integration? Doesn't anti-immigrant sentiment often correspond with complaints that new migrants are not integrating with the new society? So Tazreena, do you have any responses to these two questions?
I do, but I also am interested in the question that Tess D asked. So is it possible to address that as well?
Absolutely, I'll read that. So I associate crisis with the level of mortality experienced by migrants, especially in the Mediterranean, and crime and predation at the US southern border. Are these factors equally present in migration in other areas? So you have three questions there to wrestle with and jump in.
Well, first of all, I want to say what I say within the full understanding that I do not study Africa and African migration. So I am very humble in my approach in answering the first one. But I think, it's not about high fertility rate in Africa. You can't draw, at least for me, as a political scientist, I would suggest that you can't draw a causal link. But there is a much more complex conversation here. And there's a lot of literature on this subject about the racialization of migration and the criminalization of migration, and the fundamental assumption now that, there's a whole book out called, Young Africa, what is it called? The Scramble for Africa or something to that. And so there's a general perception there's a lot of Africans coming into Europe. And that's what probably fuels this understanding that, because Africa has such high birth rates, that's why xenophobia is happening. But whereas we actually have to study, for instance, the history of European colonial history And one of the things when we talk about drivers of migration, it's very important that we recognize what the fundamental drivers are, but we don't actually talk about colonial history, and we don't talk about the question of interventions, and we don't talk about political systems and economic systems and structures that also disenfranchise people. And so our empathy and sympathy is very much racialized, whether we wish to sort of acknowledge it or not. And this is not to say that there are not large numbers of Africans who are trying to make their way into Europe. But is it a crisis? Is the identity of Europe going to fall apart because they have sort of accepted large numbers of migrants and asylum seekers in the continent? That's a broader conversation we need to have rather than drawing this direct linkage. The second question is, yes, it is, and yes, it isn't, in terms of accepting migrant arrivals, because globally speaking, we are having this problem. The most powerful countries in the world are the ones most opposed to accepting refugees and migrants. And that sentiment is now resonating elsewhere, right? So other countries are saying, look, we can't do this anymore. And to some extent, you understand that because they have been in the forefront. I mean, countries like Lebanon and Kenya and Pakistan, they've been in the forefront of every refugee crisis that have been part of the international system for decades. And so the arrival is part of that conversation. But when we move to countries with lower numbers of refugees and asylum seekers and migrants, the question then becomes of integration, because if they are being scapegoated, as Rachel pointed out, at every cycle of an economic and political crisis, then the question becomes, again, about context, right? In terms of how is there a possibility for the quote unquote outsider to become an economic, political, and social actor in the nation state they find themselves in. I agree with you, Tess. The Mediterranean has been described as the world's deadliest border. It's something we don't pay attention to as much in the United States, with large numbers of people, particularly from the global south, dying in the Mediterranean every day, trying to reach Europe, or even if they didn't plan to reach Europe because of complex circumstances that have been driving them further northwards. We also have an ongoing situation in the US borders, or south of the US borders, where the desert has been weaponized significantly by making it much more hostile. And so we have migrant deaths that happen. There are some phenomenal organizations that work in the southern border as well. I mean, these are the most documented. Of course, in other contexts, you still have migrant deaths in the context of transit. We just don't have as much data, but neither are states in those contexts as able to make the natural terrain more hostile. And I have been very much influenced recently by critical geographers who talk about the fact that, that there is an orchestration and instrumentalization of natural terrain, whether it's the desert, the jungle, the Mediterranean and other waters, into being made more dangerous because of the policies that are put in place, and then saying it is the refugee and the migrants' fault, or it's because of human smugglers, and simplifying that conversation significantly, which means that there is no responsibility that is carried by the continents and the states that are part and package of the question. And so I think it's important for us to interrogate why, at a time when actually seafaring is quite safe, much safer than it has ever been before, that we have the mortality rates in the Mediterranean that we do. And that is by design, not as a result of natural circumstances. So I'll leave it there, and I'll leave the rest of the panels to talk about these issues more.
Great, thank you. So we do have specific questions to both Austin and Rachel, but before we turn to those, do either one of you want to speak to the conversation that Tazreena sort of opened up, or should we move on? Okay, I'll take that muted response as we're going to kind of move on. Excuse me. A question for you, Austin. I'll read the question. Earlier, Dr. Davis talked about trauma and mental health problems that refugees face. And I was curious if when migrating to neighboring countries, or for the smaller percent that move to countries like the US, are there any formal or informal programs in place to help with this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think what comes through quite clearly in our research is that the need is extraordinary. The problem generally is one of capacity. So, as we've elaborated several times already, many people who are fleeing violence, who've been forcibly displaced, who've experienced trauma, they go to places that themselves have limited resources. So in Bangladesh, for example, there are just not very many formally trained mental health professionals. And most of them live in the big urban areas. And there has been like an organized effort among those mental health professionals and from outside international humanitarian organizations to provide mental health services to Rohingya, but there aren't enough people to meet the need. And then there are other complications like language barriers. So there aren't, at the risk of going down a little bit of a rabbit hole here, but there's a dialect of Bengali that's spoken in the south of Bangladesh that's very similar to the language that the Rohingya speak. It's mutually intelligible, but even in Bangladesh, not everyone is comfortable with that dialect, and so you're limiting the pool of potential service providers even further. So I would say, yeah, my observation is that there needs to be. I don't have a good solution for you, basically, but there is a significant capacity constraint in many of these locations, and even if more capacity were there, again, there are other barriers like. If you had a bunch of extra mental health professionals, maybe they can't communicate with the people who need help. So it is, it's a serious problem and a multifaceted one.
Thank you. Thank you. Rachel, there's a question for you that's a huge question. You mentioned, it says, Rachel mentioned that we may need to dismantle capitalism to better manage population challenges. Could she expand on that? And I think that means we'll extend the session for another couple hours, but I'd love to hear just if you could offer some initial thoughts. What was your thinking behind that comment and so forth?
Yeah, I deserve that question. So lest you think I am a raging Marxist, which I don't actually identify as, but I mean, one option is a complete revolution. And I do think that often the types of root problems that we're talking about, they are systemic. And it is very difficult to bring about systemic change without completely breaking the system. And that's where revolution comes in handy. Revolution is a high bar to ask for. And so what I ask my students to do when teaching on environmental sustainability, and when we talk about this question of, is there a population crisis or is there a crisis of consumption in my population courses, I ask people to really question their own consumption. Do we need all of the things that we buy? Are there different ways to consume? And does everything always need to be so convenient? And those are hard questions. And you will find that if you choose to live a lifestyle that is reflective of the, saying, no, I choose not to consume, or I choose to consume differently, you will stick out. You will be different, because particularly in the US, but I mean, increasingly everywhere else in the world, we live in such a consumeristic society. So I think it's important to dare to do things differently, to have confidence and faith in why you do things, because it relates to a set of ethical principles that you believe are appropriate towards the treatment of other people and the planet. And to talk about those decisions with other people. And that, that is not probably going to take capitalism down, to be totally honest. But but it at least can make a small difference. And and to think locally. I mean, I think that's the other, that's hyper local, right? When it's about you, but there's a lot of things that we can do in our neighborhoods and our cities that support those broader goals.
Great. So we just have a few more minutes left. And what I'd like to ask at this moment is maybe if each of you could just take 1 minute maybe and just help us bring some closure to this. I mean, we've heard that it's a complicated issue, and I feel like we've really kind of unpacked it as well as we could in a short amount of time. But any final thoughts, if you could share them, and then I'll close out the session. So who would like to go first? Don't all jump at once. It's only a minute, so we can't spend a minute.
I can start so that my meager comments are not preempted by somebody else. I would say one of the themes that came out for me, both some of the things that I was thinking about in preparing for today, and especially some of the things that Tazreena was bringing up, was that, and even I think some of the comments that Rachel was closing on just now, like myths and misperceptions, I think are widespread and affect people's behavior politically and even personally, and things like consumption choices. And it seems to me that correcting some of those myths and misperceptions, even a very simple, modest effort like this one, where we're here trying to bring some data and share it to a bigger audience, and maybe advocate for a more conscious lifestyle. I think that's one avenue towards addressing some of these bigger problems.
Thank you. Tazreena?
Yes, thank you, Austin, for talking about myths and misperceptions. I also want everybody to constantly challenge the binaries with which you are presented. And the fundamental understanding that we seek truth that makes us feel comfortable, and are not, perhaps as a species, and this is beyond my area of expertise, we do not like feeling intellectually uncomfortable with new information. And that new information can be very problematic, particularly when it starts questioning our sense of selves and our sense of place. So, when we are positioned in terms of being the center, then we are able to make assumptions and judgments about other places and contexts and challenges. And I think that, there is no easy answer, but trying to dismantle some of that. So the broader question is, how do we dismantle capitalism? But another question running parallel to that is, how do we dismantle our knowledge base ourselves? And not to, of course, believe in conspiracy theories, but in terms of reevaluating the biases, the prejudices, the assumptions, and the truths that we carry. And being prepared. I mean, just attending a panel like this and spending some of your, summer grappling with some of the things that you have learned, you have shared, and you've thought about is starting that conversation. And by the way, we, according to so many people, we are running out of time, particularly when it comes to the environmental crisis and its links to consumption. So begin there. Being revolutionary does not necessarily mean being violent. It also means being revolutionary in your intellectual thinking and your emotional capacity for empathy. And so those things are important. I want you to walk away with that as well.
Thank you. And Rachel?
I'll just quickly say, 63% of you at the beginning said that you felt there was a population crisis. And I presume that you interpreted that question in many different ways and in lots of the different ways that we talked about. I would just wrap up by saying, try to do something about it. That could be learning. It could be becoming more familiar with an organization that works in a particular area that matters to it. It could be, again, taking local action. It could be, if you happen to not live in the District of Columbia and therefore have political representation, it could be writing letters to Congress people. I mean, there are so many things that do actually make a difference. So it's about trying to overcome cynicism and to believing that you can make a difference. So if we call something a crisis, we need to take responsibility to act.
Great. So I'm going to just finish with a cliche, which is that the word crisis, as many of you may know, in Mandarin is made of two characters, one on top of the other. And the first character, and so I want to argue there is a crisis because the first character is danger and the second character is opportunity. And we have such an opportunity with regard to this issue. And I want to thank each of you, the panelists, for sharing your thoughts today. I want to thank, we had so many great questions we couldn't get to, but we'll just keep those questions alive for ourselves. Thank you very much, everyone. And I don't know if you finished by saying be fruitful and multiply, but be fruitful and multiply in the many ways that one can multiply. So thank you very much. And